Mark Lynas, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Yascha. It's great to be back.
You always have cheerful topics in store for us, from climate change to nuclear war. Nuclear war is one of those things that we all kind of learn to worry about at some point in our childhood. It's obvious that it's this kind of strange looming danger hanging over humanity. And at the same time, it's usually in the background of discussions. Not since the Cuban Missile Crisis has it really been at the absolute forefront of the news. Where would you rank the risk from nuclear war relative to the other big existential risks facing humanity?
Wow, I mean, there's a lot in that. And I agree that thinking or worrying about nuclear war feels a bit retro. It's sort of like since the end of the Cold War, certainly my generation, I'm not sure how close in age we are. I think I might be a bit older than you. But I grew up with nuclear war being this.
But you have more hair, Mark, so it's okay.
I didn't want to judge. But we were all ready to die at pretty much any time before the Berlin Wall came down, and suddenly the Cold War was over, and suddenly the risk of nuclear Armageddon seemed to have disappeared completely. We were friends with Russia, and that people stopped worrying about it. And I think people were very glad to be able to drop it from the list of existential risks that they had to spend any amount of time worrying about. And then, of course, climate came. And I've contributed to the sense of existential crisis that is attached to climate change with some of the writing that I've done. My book 6 Degrees talked about climates, certainly in the extreme warming scenarios, as very much a catastrophic risk, not just to humanity but to the planetary biosphere. And so that then became the preeminent concern of this generation, and certainly of younger people. You had Greta Thunberg and you had the Fridays for Future movement, and that generation then grew up with climate being their existential risk, and of course there's other ones, and there's books about which existential risks are greater than which other existential risks, whether it's AI or pandemics or asteroid collisions or whatever, and we can get into ranking them if you like. I actually had a piece in the Wall Street Journal recently, co-authored with Ted Nordhaus from the Breakthrough Institute, actually making the point as gently as we could that climate is an existential risk of a different nature to nuclear war, in that there are off-ramps. The impacts of climate change manifest over decades or even centuries if you're talking about the melting of the large ice sheets and multi-meter sea level rise and so on. Whereas, of course, as we all know, nuclear war can destroy the biosphere in pretty much half an hour. It doesn't take very long to get ICBMs in the air and striking and burning the major cities of the Northern Hemisphere, which is the existential risk that, and it's not actually the bombs. It's not just
and one of the So one of the things that's interesting here, and it's a gruesome thing to talk about, but I think it's actually important to be intellectually rigorous about it, is that the distribution of outcomes seems to me, at least intuitively, to be somewhat different. So, climate change is a very serious risk to humanity. I think the likelihood that it leads to a significant number of deaths, to a significant number of people's lives being impaired, is perilously high. And all of those are very good reasons to worry about it, to make the fight against it a priority.
Yeah.
It is harder for me to see a scenario in which climate change actually destroys humanity, or even destroys, broadly speaking, our level of technological civilization. It's easy to imagine hundreds of millions of people dying, and that obviously is a very, very bad thing. It's harder to see how climate change leads to either the death of 99% of humanity, or sort of us being unable to sustain the level of technological advancement that we have as a species. Whereas the risk of nuclear war is perhaps lower, in the sense that a bad outcome is less likely. You might disagree about that, but I think it's easier to imagine, we somehow get through the 21st century without a nuclear war, and there's just no immediate downside from having those weapons. But if the negative case is activated, it's much easier to imagine a scenario in which the vast majority of humanity dies, in which we're basically back in the Stone Age. So perhaps we can start to dig a little bit into that. what would it look like if we had a global nuclear war anytime soon? If there is a nuclear confrontation between, say, the United States and China that in some way also draws in other nuclear powers. The worst case scenario, what is that the end of humanity? Is that the end of our technological civilization? What would that mean for the planet and for humans?
Yes, I mean, I'm a student of mass extinctions. I've covered them a lot in my book in terms of the big five geological mass extinctions that have happened since the Cambrian, over the last 500 million years. And for climate change, at least in the sense that we're currently experiencing it, yes, there's 100% probability of climate change because it's already happening, whereas nuclear war can never happen. So it's a different thing altogether. But there are the kill mechanisms aren't there, to use the mass extinction terminology, for climate change. There are many more ways to adapt to slow onset events, such as are likely to result from climate impacts. Whereas with nuclear war, the kill mechanisms are very obvious, and it's not just the explosions from the bombs and the blasts and the burning and so on. It's the nuclear winter, and that's really the central kill mechanism, which can certainly destroy civilization, possibly destroy humans as a species, and certainly destroy the majority of life in the biosphere.
And I feel like nuclear winter is the kind of term that everybody has probably heard, but that many people will have trouble fully understanding, both in terms of mechanisms that lead to a nuclear winter and then what that would mean. So if you have, a significant amount of nuclear weapons deployed between two superpowers in the world, why would that cause a nuclear winter, and what would that nuclear winter look like? Tell us some of these gruesome details.
Yeah, so I mean, India-Pakistan war with 100 nukes or something wouldn't deliver a planet-wide nuclear winter. It would make things slightly cooler for a bit, like a large volcano. A major missile exchange between the superpowers would lead to a nuclear winter if you burn most of the large cities of the Northern Hemisphere. And the mechanism is very well established now. You can see it happening in wildfires and some of the firestorms that have happened in human cities. Hamburg delivered not a nuclear winter, but it did deliver a pyrocumulonimbus, which is these big thunderclouds, which are the mechanism by which soot, which are these dark particles, are transported into the stratosphere, which is above the troposphere where the world's weather happens. So if enough soot is in the stratosphere, then it can't be removed by rain. And actually, because it's black, it gets heated up by the sun and gets higher and higher into the stratosphere, and essentially becomes a veil which wraps around the Earth and prevents sunlight reaching the surface in the same intensity. And if you put enough, and the worst case scenario that's studied in the paper I refer to in my book, which was published in Nature Food in 2022, has about 150 teragrams of soot. And that's enough to essentially make it fully dark at the planet's surface. And the temperatures go below zero practically worldwide, and don't rise above zero in the mid-latitudes. Somewhere like Iowa is below zero for about 750 days, I think. So there are no more harvests. And there is no possibility of humans surviving, even with stored food supplies in any significant numbers at all, the subsequent nuclear famine that would inevitably result from that.
So take us through the stages of this, right? So you have, let's say, China and the United States going to nuclear war with each other, having this very significant exchange of nuclear weapons. How many people would die as a direct result of that exchange of nuclear arms, and how many people globally would be likely to survive the ensuing nuclear winter?
Well, so the majority of people survive the initial war. The death toll from an exchange of let's say 1,500 nukes each, so 3,000, say 1 megaton nuclear explosion, just for the sake of argument, that would probably kill between a third of a billion and 3/4 of a billion people. And so the majority of the population is left alive. And if you look at this Nature food paper, then you have to look at what proportion of the population can survive the ensuing food crisis. And there's actually a table in this paper which goes through all of the countries' populations. I think for the United States, 99% die. Some countries it's 100%. But for virtually all countries in the world lose the majority of their populations. And I redid the figures for a world of 8 billion, and it's getting close to 7 billion would die in the famine, the nuclear famine, according to these model extrapolations. And that's based on what food might remain and distributing it amongst the population, so that with a sort of lifeboat ethics approach, so that whatever the proportion is that can have sufficient calories, they're able to do that. Everyone else then dies.
Would there be some way for preparing for this? I mean, if the United States is spending enormous amounts of money on national security, if somebody at the Pentagon took very, very seriously the risk of nuclear war and the nuclear winter, would it in theory be possible to start storing up enough preserved food that the American population would be able to get through that kind of nuclear winter? Is that just one of the precautions that humanity should try and implement at that scale? I mean, we can obviously produce all kinds of foodstuffs that are sufficiently nourishing and keep for over 2 years, even ones that actually storage is not going to be a problem. It's going to be so cold, so you can just store things outside. But you can have canned tuna for 2 years, whatever. The problem is just that we haven't done that, right? But presumably, would it in theory be possible to prepare for a nuclear winter in that way, and thereby significantly boost the number of people who would survive it?
That's an interesting question. It's a bit like terraforming. It's a bit like suddenly you're on an uninhabitable planet and you've got 8 billion people to feed, or if you're thinking at the level of a single country, maybe a couple hundred million. How do you do that for 3 years? I guess it's not fully inconceivable that you could store enough foodstuffs, or you need to be able to produce food without using photosynthesis. So you need to find other ways of synthesizing fresh food and being able to store the ingredients for that. And it's akin to any kind of sunlight blocking catastrophe. So a supervolcano or a very large asteroid would do the same thing. And so it's a conversation that's worth having. What are survival mechanisms if you want the species to survive? I think Elon Musk's plan of going to Mars is probably the least reliable way of doing this. And Earth will still be better than Mars under any plausible scenario. So yes, if you want the species to survive,
and presumably it's less about figuring out how to grow food during the nuclear winter. It's just about pre-producing the food before the nuclear winter and storing in such a way that you have enough reserves to get through the nuclear winter.
Well, and you'd need to be able to stop people who you don't prioritize for survival being able to access that, or being able to seize it.
Well, unless you have enough food that people know they're going to get through it. And so all of them, you talk in quite vivid detail about how, because there'd be such an extreme famine, you would get these roving gangs and, all of this kind of violence that would ensue in people trying to procure the foodstuff that they need. But, if over the next 10 years, we simply say up U.S. agricultural production by a certain amount in order to produce all of these vast stores of food that would get us through 3 years, then you avoid not only the starvation, but also the kind of mechanisms that produce the need for that gang warfare, the need for these roaming gangs of people, desperately searching for food and using violence and weapons in order to procure it.
Yes, so you need to be able to obviously maintain and defend mechanisms of centralized political authority. I mean, you have to be able to distribute food. I mean, if none of it's being produced independently on farms, then it needs to have just some kind of distribution system that needs to be defensible, and it needs to be delivered in a way that obviously you can maintain social stability. How you do that in a freezing world of total darkness for at least several months. I mean, precipitation levels don't return to pre-war levels, so it doesn't rain or snow at anything like the same extent, and for at least a decade. So it's also a very, very long time. I think it's at the moment inconceivable to store the amount of food that would be required to sustain the current global population.
So let's assume that this scheme that I just made up does not work. There's this huge famine, and presumably there's also a lot of people dying from the after effects of radiation and so on throughout this period? What would the level, presumably the medical system would break down? What would the level of illness, pestilence, and sickness look like during this nuclear winter?
Well, I mean, immediately after the bombs, there's no triage. I don't think there's any conceivable medical system that can support that level of death and destruction. So everyone who's injured is going to die, particularly if they've got acute radiation sickness. But most of them are dead within a month or two. And after that, the radiation is a fairly trivial concern. There might be, a couple of percentage points of cancer increase incidence in decades to come, but really that's the least of your problems. So I wouldn't be too worried about radiation so long as you can get people into fallout shelters for a couple of months in the hottest zones initially, and keep them alive and well supplied in that scenario. I can't believe I'm talking about how to survive a nuclear war. The whole point is not to have one, but you did ask the question. But yes, so that's actually, I think food is really the big one in this issue.
And so if we don't take significantly additional preparations to what exists today, right? If this happened tomorrow, and we have, as you're saying, up to 1 billion people die from the direct impact of this nuclear war, and then up to 99%, perhaps more in some places, of a population starving to death in the years after that, where does that leave humanity? I mean, if this nuclear war happens in 2025, what does the world look like by 2035? And what does it look like by 2055 or 2075? I mean, are we basically back in the Stone Age? Or do you think that enough humans survive with enough knowledge that some of the technology that we've developed over the last thousands of years is there and humanity starts to rebuild? I mean, is this potentially a literal extinction event where humanity just disappears? Or is it, an event that kills the majority of humans, obviously leads to huge devastation in all kinds of ways, but that allows those humans who somehow survive this bottleneck to rebuild something like the civilization we know in the decades and centuries to come?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. So I don't think anybody foresees this as a total human extinction event. But those humans who survive are living in a devastated biosphere where all of the trappings of civilization, from electricity to internet connectivity to world trade, will have ceased to function because most of the major countries have been wiped out. So there are, I keep referring to this Nature food paper because that's the one that actually quantified the death tolls in different places. I mean, there were some countries that had 0% deaths. I think Argentina, Australia, so countries which have very large land areas, produce large amounts of agricultural surplus at the moment for export, which would obviously not be exported, and have relatively small populations. So yeah, Argentina, Australia, one or two others. So it's not as if in this scenario everybody dies, but I think the kind of post-apocalyptic society is very difficult to visualize. We don't really have many historical analogues, even from famines. I talk about cannibalism because that's a fairly common occurrence in famines, and even in shipwrecks and plane crashes and things. So it's quite likely that humans would eat each other, and that's the main source of remaining food in years like 2 to 3 to 4. But what happens in the kind of rebuilding scenario, I really have no clue. I mean, humans have rebuilt very successfully from past cataclysms. If you think of the Second World War, look how quickly Japan and Germany rebuilt after that in cities which were basically just flat ruins. So I think the least likely thing is total human extinction, but it's more possible, obviously, if you have drastically fewer humans on the planet in a very devastated biosphere.
Right, and obviously there's a lot of deaths in Japan and Germany in World War II, and the urban landscape was very significantly devastated, but the majority of the population did survive, and so it's sort of hard to know how to extrapolate from a situation in which some significant percentage of the population died, but most of it is intact, to a situation where, say, 99% of the population dies. And, of course, a situation in which the same devastation has happened everywhere else. The devastation of World War II was massive around the world, but it's obviously also very important centers of population and of economic activity, but weren't devastated in the same way like the United States. And so here, if we're imagining the devastation is practically everywhere, that would significantly change the situation. You're right to say that it's probably very difficult to know exactly what it would be like. I have a personal question for you that I was wondering about as I was thinking about this, which is, would you rather survive or would you rather die? Would you rather die in the initial blast, or would you rather be among the people, spending the following years searching and scraping around for food and defending yourself against these roving bands of people who want to steal any of the food you might somehow have stored, or perhaps be forced, if you want to survive, to join those gangs. I think my instinct is to say I love my life and I enjoy being alive on this earth, but I think it might be more merciful to go in that first second of nuclear blast if you happen to be at the center of it.
Yes, I mean, if you read Cormac McCarthy's book The Road, that's sort of the conundrum there, is what's left worth living for? I mean, there's this sort of love story between the father and the son, and the father obviously tries to remain alive for the sake of the son, but what kind of world is the son going to be living within? And it was sort of in the back of my head as I was writing this book. And our parents, I mean, used to say, I'd rather be under the first bomb. Having written this book, I can see why. And I think they were probably right. I don't, having to live, it's sort, I guess the closest parallel I can think of is Holocaust, the struggle for survival in somewhere like Auschwitz, where all morality has gone, and the best you can hope for is some kind of degenerate existence where you're desperately scrabbling for food, grains of food on the floor and fighting against other people, grandmothers, children, to get to it. So is that a world I want to try and survive within? I'm not really sure it is, no.
Okay, so we've done the really gruesome stuff at the beginning of this conversation, actually trying to inform people and think through what this would look like. I think the question now is, that's not what any of us want to happen. How do we avoid it? So let's backtrack a couple of steps. Tell us about the history of the development of nuclear weapons and why it is that so far we have been able to avoid nuclear confrontation. There's the famous clock by, I forget what it's called, nuclear scientists, how close we are. The doomsday clock. And the doomsday clock is sort of, 5 minutes to 12 at all times. It's been at 5 minutes to 12 for more than 5 minutes, and we haven't reached doomsday yet. So, why is it that so far we've been able to avoid this really gruesome outcome?
Yeah, so nuclear weapons are obviously famously developed in the Manhattan Project at the latter stages of the Second World War, and as everyone knows from Oppenheimer and just general knowledge, there was 2 atomic bombs used in Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the 6th and 9th of August 1945. The Americans had more bombs planned. They were planning to drop bombs on Kyoto and other Japanese cities that had been spared from this huge firebombing campaign, which had already killed hundreds of thousands of people, including that infamous raid in Tokyo, and I think it was 10th of March 1945, which was the largest single death toll in any air raid, which is bigger than Hiroshima. So the
firebombing of Tokyo actually was more deadly than the nuclear strikes, right?
Exactly.
And it's just because so much of the center of Tokyo was wooden houses, it wasn't, I guess, similar to the nuclear winter in that sense. It wasn't the strikes themselves and the bombs themselves that killed most people, for they killed a substantial number. It was just this giant firestorm that resulted.
And it was designed that way. I mean, the Americans designed their incendiary weapons to cause a firestorm. That was the whole point of it. So they were dropped on a target which was already burning. These were napalm bombs to cause the maximum amount of damage to the particular type of housing that Japan had. And there was a program to wipe out city after city after city, night after night after night. And it was believed that would win the war, which it's arguable the extent to which that delivered earlier Japanese surrender versus the invasion of Soviet troops as well, which was happening at the same time. But the history of nuclear weapons after that time, of course, is that the Soviets got them very quickly due to the information that they got from Karl Fuchs, primarily on the Manhattan Project, who was the British spy who was passing secrets to the Russians. So by the 50s, you have an arms race where the Soviets are building up their nuclear capabilities as fast as possible. Then you get the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. When I think the world realizes how close it is to nuclear Armageddon. And it actually was. I mean, on Black Saturday, which I think is the 27th of October, I might have got the date wrong, but there was a Soviet sub which was forced to surface by the Americans. I don't know if you know this story, Yascha, but it's pretty incredible. And the Americans didn't know that this Soviet sub had a nuclear-armed torpedo, and they were strafing it and dropping depth charges, and this sub was eventually forced to surface. And the captain was about to order a dive and order the firing of this nuclear torpedo at the American Navy, which would have started a nuclear war over Cuba. And one of the Soviet signaller got stuck on the conning tower while trying, to descend so they could shut the hatches and prepare the dive. And there was a commander who outranked, had a fairly high status and outranked the captain, who was able to, in that delay, read that the American Navy was signaling an apology and cancel the order to fire. It was that close, and that was after Kennedy and Khrushchev.
So a matter of minutes and a matter of really a coincidence, a malfunction.
Seconds. Khrushchev and Kennedy had already been desperate to de-escalate by this point, but facts on the ground had their own momentum, and so the Soviets also had nuclear missiles ready to go in Cuba much earlier than the Americans thought. So if they'd invaded, which the military top brass wanted to do, there would have been nuclear war then too. So there was numerous scenarios with Cuba that the world came very, very close indeed. And of course, there's been many subsequent incidents, whether it's bombs dropping out of planes by accident or accidentally blowing up, like that Titan II missile did in 1980 in Arkansas, or false information about an incoming strike. And so that's what's so dangerous, really, is inadvertent nuclear war as much as the real thing.
How much should the concern be about nuclear proliferation? So you say obviously the United States was the first country to get a nuclear bomb. The Soviet Union quickly followed. Eventually, China exploded the bomb, I believe, in the 1960s, if I'm remembering correctly. And
the UK has one earlier as well. Yeah.
Yes.
The UK has one in the 50s. Yeah.
I believe there's some question today about whether the UK is actually physically capable of deploying a nuclear bomb without American assistance, which is rather striking. But
that's true, and that's a question now with the Trump era. That's a serious question for the UK, which doesn't apply to France, let's say.
Now India and Pakistan, Israel has never acknowledged to have that they have a bomb, but they evidently do. North Korea has nuclear facilities. Iran is trying to develop the nuclear bomb and appears to be quite close to it. How does the probability of nuclear war increase because of that proliferation?
That's a really interesting question, and I look at this mathematically, actually, in the book. So, I mean, the published figure is about 1% for inadvertent nuclear war. So that's the estimated probability each year, and probability isn't cumulative mathematically. So it's not like 1%, 2% over 100 years. It would be 100%. But if you throw a set of dice lots of times, you're more likely to get a certain outcome than you would do if you're throwing it once. So it is, in that sense, it is cumulative, and so the probability over a century of a nuclear war is probably about 2/3 of that's just of inadvertent nuclear war, and is higher for intentional nuclear war. So it's a significant risk over long periods of time. which is more than 50-50 odds probably. And that's, I think, what's so scary is that, any single day we're probably not going to have a nuclear war. Every single year we're probably not going to have a nuclear war. But over time, the risk in that sense accumulates to a very dangerous level indeed.
And what is the chance of being able to contain a nuclear war in some kind of way? Obviously the United States deployed 2 nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and since then there hasn't really been use of nuclear arms. Is there some world in which if India and Pakistan's war escalates, there is an exchange of 1 nuclear weapon each, and when somehow politicians are able to stop further deployment of nuclear weapons? Or is the existential threat when you know that your adversary is deploying a nuclear weapon against you so high that you just immediately need to deploy all of the nuclear weapons you have to try and degrade their ability to continue attacking you, such that once you have nuclear war, it virtually by definition is all-out nuclear war?
Well, it sort of is for the US. I mean, the US has a launch on warning posture. So I called the book 6 Minutes to Winter because theoretically the US president has 6 minutes to decide whether to respond to incoming missiles when they're just blips on a radar screen, which is obviously an impossibly short window to make a decision about the future survival or not of civilization. But the theory has always been and remains that you have to get your ICBMs out of their silos before any of the incoming missiles hit. And obviously that raises the risk of inadvertent nuclear war because you have to trust the technology that the blips are actually real. And some, there's been several occasions when there's been blips and they've not been real on both sides, both in Russia and the United States. But that suggests that the leaderships, and I think Russia probably has a similar posture, although it's much less clear, believe that they need to have a full retaliation to any incoming missile threat. So it's less likely you get 2 or 3 missiles exchanged and then people back off. I mean, the other way to look at this is through wargaming, and there's been lots of exercises where they do tend to escalate because you need to retaliate against an incoming missile, and then you've lost 2 million people, and maybe your capital city's being attacked. So then you release several hundred, and one way or another you get to the full exchange.
What about the distinction between a regional war and a global war? I mean, presumably, if it's involved the United States in exchange, particularly with Russia or China, that would effectively turn into a global nuclear war relatively quickly. What if it is India and Pakistan or some of those more regional powers? Is there an imaginable scenario where it gets contained to that region of the world? And what would the impact and outcome of that be?
Yeah, I mean, I looked at the weapons inventories of India and Pakistan recently. I mean, the Indian one's just been published in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And they've probably got a couple of hundred warheads each. So I mean, the scenario would be, let's say they destroy each other and they destroy all of their major cities and, several 100 million people die. It would probably deliver enough of a punch to the atmosphere that you'd get a degree or 2 of cooling for a year or so. So it would be a bit like Mount Pinatubo in 1992. Times 3. So it would affect global food production, and of course it would be a cataclysmic shock to the world in political and lots of other ways. But it's survivable for the rest of the planet. So a regional nuclear war is a survivable event for sure for the majority of the world's population. Obviously not for the competent powers, and that's different obviously from an unsurvivable nuclear war where it's not just the competent powers who are wiped out, but also almost everyone else as well.
All right. So what do we do about all of that? Beyond thinking about it and scaring ourselves and telling horror stories to our children if we're inclined to psychologically torture them. What do you think the number 1, number 2, number 3 priority is in terms of trying to avert what obviously would be a horrendous outcome?
I mean, it sounds a bit trite, but we have to start talking about it. And at the moment, you feel a little bit ashamed. When I told people I was writing a book about nuclear war, people laugh, or they say, that sounds a bit depressing. And, God, Mark, can't you stop writing about depressing things because your last book was on climate? So I think that's one. And you've also got to try to start to formulate a sort of grassroots bottom-up political pressure. So the kind of movement that's paid huge attention to climate change over the last 15, 20 years and has put it on the agenda to the extent that, all right, there's a backlash currently going on, but it's put it on the agenda to the extent that all the major economies are now covered by net zero targets. We have annual COPs, huge amounts of attention are given to the issue. None of that happens with nuclear risk. There's annual meetings of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, which I think came into force in 2021. And this is a treaty that's been signed by half the world, more than 90 countries, ratified by over 70, and most people don't even know it exists. I talk to audiences about this, no hands go up when I talk about the TPNW. So but I think it's important because there is a legal mechanism at United Nations level for the full abolition of nuclear weapons, and I think there are mechanisms within the TPNW as well to begin to up the pressure on nuclear weapons holding states, of which there's only 9. To force them to the negotiating table to start to get serious again about arms control. But recently the reverse has been happening. All of the arms control treaties that the legacy of the Cold War have begun to fall apart.
How realistic is it that we're ever going to get to complete? How realistic is it that we're ever going to get to these nuclear powers willingly giving up their arms? There's two concerns here, right? Like, one is obviously that even a superpower that has an ability to defend itself very effectively by conventional means is going to be deeply mistrustful of whether its geopolitical rivals are actually going to be sticking to the same deal, right? So the United States is not at risk of physical attack from China in any meaningful way. Perhaps it's willing to take its chances and say we can defend ourselves with conventional weapons if it need be. We can give up on the nuclear weapons. But they will say, well, China would obviously dominate us and Russia would dominate us and any power would dominate us if they did have nuclear weapons, and we didn't. So if we give up ours, and these other powers retain their capacity by cheating, by not adhering to the deal, by somehow being able to delude us about this, then suddenly we're in this incredibly weakened position. And that's a pretty powerful argument for those powers not to be willing to do that. And presumably there's a similar logic for smaller powers. The reason why places like North Korea and Iran are so invested in their nuclear arsenals that they feel that is the defense of last resort against potential attack. That the moment that you have nuclear weapons, that is what protects you against conventional incursions into your territory. And of course, one of the strange ironies about this is that we've made this strange Faustian bargain where the risk of human annihilation, paradoxically, is also one of the reasons why we've had relatively fewer deaths in war, despite the horrible conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East and so on, than we did for most of humanity, actually. Precisely because so many of the major powers are not going to go to war with each other because of this risk of nuclear escalation.
Yeah, that latter point I think is arguable. I think Russia was emboldened to mount a full invasion of Ukraine in 2022 precisely because it had nuclear weapons and Ukraine didn't. So the existence of nuclear weapons didn't actually prevent war in that. They actually made it more likely. And we have to have a situation where humans can carry on fighting wars, but without the biosphere being destroyed. And so even reducing the numbers of nuclear weapons down to, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 each or something. But then does every country have 10 or 15, or is it still only the current 9? And then if one country has 20 or 50 or 100, then you're back in an arms race. So I think what's crucial here is to abandon any thoughts of unilateralism. I think that's what went wrong with CND and the old, peace campaigns back in the 70s and 80s, that the demand for unilateral disarmament was foolish and felt foolish at the time. And that's your only, to use Trump language, that's the only cards that you hold, is the offer to disarm your own nuclear weapons if your opponent will consider will do likewise, and in some kind of verifiable, fully verifiable manner, in a sort of stepwise process. And you have to, of course, have full control over all fissile materials and also the civilian nuclear fuel cycle, because of proliferation risks. Which, the mechanisms, again, all exist for this. This is what the IAEA exists to do and does very successfully everywhere. And that's, of course, why we know the Iranians are going for a bomb by enriching uranium to far higher extent than they ever need to do for any kind of civilian reactor. And how the world responds to that is the Israelis are more likely to attack Iran because they want to prevent Iran having a nuclear weapon, and Iran is very likely to go for a nuclear weapon because, as with North Korea, it's the ultimate guarantee of regime survival. So something's going to happen. Both those positions can't hold indefinitely. Something will give. But at the same time, we also have to not forget the long-term ambition of getting to what I call global zero, because that's the only way that human civilization will survive long-term. And by long-term, I mean decades and centuries hence.
Yeah, and it's important to distinguish your position from the one of unilateral disarmament, which obviously seems unrealistic, right? I mean, when you have serious geopolitical rivals who do have a nuclear bomb, to say we're just on our own going to disarm ourselves weakens your position in a way that very few leaders are going to be willing to do, and very few electorates are going to be willing to support within democratic countries. To say we're going to try and reach some kind of global deal where we're all disarming at the same time. Obviously still involves those nuclear 9 weakening their position relative to other countries compared to a status quo, but is perhaps more imaginable. What are the prospects of some form of global agreement? I mean, it feels to me that two things are going on at the same time, at least in my thinking about this topic relative to 10 or 20 years ago. One is that we seem to be in a more conflictual world with leaders who are more self-interested and more assertive and less concerned about global goods like safety against nuclear power than we were a number of decades ago. It would be somewhat easier to see the cast of leaders 20 or 30 years ago making that kind of deal than it is to imagine the current cast of leaders. So the prospects for global zero seem to me to be lower even than they were 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, at the same time, inversely, it also seems to me that the underlying risk is higher than I would have assessed it to be a few decades ago. The risk was always there, was always real. You talked very compellingly about how close we came to the Cuban Missile Crisis and so on. But I at least had some kind of sense growing up in the, coming to political consciousness as a teenager in the 90s and then as a student and so on in the 2000s, that there was some basic rationality to the world, right? That in the end, political leaders made relatively rational decisions. They didn't want to destroy the world. That in the end, we had mechanisms to prevent the worst-case outcomes, that we'd worried about a global pandemic breaking out for a long time, but every time that there was talk about how this or that virus might be turning to a global pandemic, we had public health authorities do an effective job of stopping that from doing. And I think it made it very easy to sort of assume that, yes, we need to think about all of these risks, but in the end, we have these rational systems that are somehow going to contain these risks and things are going to be fine. In part because of the pandemic, in part because of the how erratic some major world leaders now are, in part because of the extent of war that has increased in the last years, such as in Ukraine. I'm sort of less sanguine on that, right? It's always tempting to think if some horrible outcome hasn't happened, perhaps it can't happen. But that is, I think, intellectually wrong, and it feels like the preconditions for a really catastrophic outcome are higher now than they were a few decades ago in those ways as well. But that's a pretty depressing outcome, right? Where we're saying the prospects for getting to global zero are lower than they were in the past. the risk, or at least our understanding of a risk, is more severe because some of those seemingly rational systems turn out not to be all of that rational. Is it possible to remain hopeful in that situation?
It's obviously difficult to imagine or to visualize something for which there is no substantial political constituency, no demand. But that's why I use the analogy of climate change, because I've been around long enough and campaigning on that issue to remember what it was like when no one gave a toss. And when EVs were milk floats, they were just a joke. Solar panels cost $10,000 per square inch, and it was inconceivable that modern human industrial civilization could function without fossil fuels. And we were heading towards a world of 5-6 degrees, and again a catastrophic outcome. We're not in that world now. We're fully committed, I think, now to a clean energy transition. It's going to take a long time, and we're going to get plus 2 degrees, and it's going to be a very challenging few decades to come on the climate front alone. But that change came about both for technological and for political reasons, and I think the technologies and the politics are intertwined in that sense, and the economics too. But I think the politics comes first. You have to have we have to have a significant political demand, at least in democratic countries, for a de-escalation of nuclear risk, and that's not there at the moment. And it's something that we need to organise, whoever we is. And I've tried to do my part to raise attention to it and to help, to some small extent, put it back on the agenda. And I just hope now that sufficient people realise that it's so that the risk is still there. I mean, people had gone off nuclear winter thinking it was debunked and so on. It's not, and that's I think why it's difficult for us to imagine a world without nuclear weapons, because nobody's currently asking for it.
So I think you've given us a persuasive warning and told us a little bit about what we would have to do politically in order to deal with this. I do also want to talk about this other topic that you keep mentioning, because you've written very widely about it, which is climate change. So perhaps we can end the conversation by talking about that for some moments. One of your best-known books is called 6 Degrees. It's about how we can live on a hotter planet. I was struck a moment ago, but he said, well, probably we're going to end up in a 2 degrees future. How has the fight against climate change changed over the last decades? And why does it seem like, from what I'm hearing between the lines, that some of the worst case scenarios that still seemed realistic when you were writing that book now appear to be less likely? Why is it that we can hopefully, in quotation marks, look forward to a planet that is 2 degrees warmer, which, as you point out, is still a significant challenge, rather than 6 degrees warmer?
There's a simple answer to that, and the reason is because the emission scenarios that you need to get to 5-6 degrees are no longer plausible. I mean, you need to increase global coal use by a factor of 5 to 10 or something. I mean, whereas it's obvious that coal is peaking. Nobody's building, terawatts of coal, and no one's planning to. China's planning to get out of coal. China's coal use has probably peaked already. China's CO2 emissions may already have peaked, and that's the single most important global signal in terms of climate futures. On the other hand, we are passing 1.5 already, which was supposed to be the Paris target, agreed only 10 years ago in 2015. And we're seeing that now, not just in real time, but almost in the rearview mirror. We're now looking towards 2 degrees. But if you look at the warming, which is implied by the current global, if you put together all of the government's plans for their fossil fuel use going into the second half of the century, it gets you to still under 3 degrees. So probably, I don't know, I'd put money on somewhere between 2.4 and 2.7. And that's a very different world from the 6 degree world. It's a world that humans can survive and even thrive in, although there will be significant challenges to ecosystems as well as the more vulnerable human societies and economies.
And why has that change happened? Is that political will? Is it technological development? Is it a mix of those? Why is it that some of those urgent warnings by you and others that we're on the way to a 6-degree warmer planet have not panned out?
I actually think, I mean, I don't know which way around these things came, but I think without technology it would have been inconceivable. So without the technological change, which has now given us a hugely cheap solar, which can do the main can be the mainstay of a carbon-free economy. We've still got problems with aviation. I can't see how that's currently decarbonising. We've still got problems with steel, ammonia. Agriculture is still going to be a significant emitter with deforestation and land use change and so on. But the majority of the technologies that we'll need to decarbonize the global economy are either have been invented or are now becoming so cheap that they're becoming mass use. EVs as well. I think we're past the tipping point. Whatever the Trump administration wants to do, all they're doing is consigning themselves to becoming a backwater in this transition. And China is going to fully dominate and already fully dominates in all of the supply chains, whether it's critical minerals, solar, EVs, and the rest of it. And nuclear as well now. I mean, I think there's a nuclear renaissance ongoing with both with SMRs and with the more conventional light water reactors, which will also help deliver large-scale 24/7 clean power, which doesn't have any of the intermittency challenges of renewables. So yeah, it's largely technology, but possibly the technology came about because of the political demands for it. I'm not sure.
Let's touch on nuclear for a moment. You're obviously somebody who's very, very worried about nuclear war. At the same time, I understand that you do favor deployment of civilian nuclear energy, nuclear reactors, and so on, in the context of climate change. For people who may feel pulled in different directions on this topic, who may think that there's some kind of contradiction here, right? You have a person who's saying nuclear power is this incredibly dangerous thing that might destroy humanity, and yet we're supposed to deploy more nuclear reactors, etc., in the fight against climate change. Why are those two things not a contradiction? Why is nuclear power important in the fight against climate change, according to you? Why can't it just be renewables like solar? And why do the risks that we're talking about in the context of nuclear war not really apply to if a nuclear reactor goes wrong in the way that it did in Chernobyl and so on?
Yeah, I mean, Chernobyl and Fukushima are minor industrial accidents. Killed a couple of thousand people in the case of Chernobyl, nobody in Fukushima. They shouldn't have scared humanity away from nuclear power. Nuclear is, I think, a fully sustainable technology. If you have a closed nuclear fuel cycle and you use all of the spent fuel and all of the uranium-238, which has been left over from fuel enrichment from the past, in fast reactors, I actually did the calculations for that this week because I'm doing a report on it. You can run the United States at current electricity consumption fully for 1,000 years. If you include thorium, it could be tens of thousands of years probably. So it's as sustainable in that sense as wind and solar, given that the sun's not going to run out. And it's just because nuclear can deliver huge amounts of energy, and you can see that in bombs as well, of course. I mean, the technologies are very, very closely related. But I don't think that you can run a fully, 24/7 energy-hungry world just on wind and solar either. I mean, the battery capacity for storage you'd need to deliver seasonal shifts in electricity use are just gigantic, and you'd need to, I'm not even sure there's enough critical minerals out there to do it. So it does make sense to deliver some of that base load and variability back up from nuclear, and it makes sense almost, well, it not necessarily everywhere. You don't necessarily need it in the sunniest countries, but you certainly need it in a majority of the world as an option.
One of the striking things is that I believe a majority of CO2 is now emitted by developing countries or countries in the global south, or whatever term you want to use, but it's no longer by the United States and Western European countries and so on and so forth. How do you think that to change how the citizens of those Western democracies think about the role of climate change in their politics? How can German citizens, American citizens, British citizens take account of the contribution that they have historically made to climate change and the ways in which their economies obviously do continue to contribute to it, but also not be naive about the fact that actually they've really become a sideshow at this point in terms of curbing future CO2 emissions?
Yeah, I mean, it's going tolerably well. Europe is on course, I think, to cut its emissions by about 50% on, I think it's probably 1990 levels by 2030. Emissions have been going down, even in the US and across all of the developed economies, over the last decade or so. And net zero is not going to be achieved by 2050, which of course is the mainstay global goal, but it will be close, I think. At the moment, we've got a backlash going on with the populist parties having taken on anti-net zero and anti-climate as one of their kind of anti-woke things. You'll be more of an expert on the political underpinnings of that, but I think we have to see past it, and I don't think that there's going to be a huge resurgence of global fossil fuel use and going back to technologies which are now increasingly becoming obsolete. I mean, the internal combustion engine is going the way of the horse. Horses didn't disappear, but they're not going to be the mainstay of surface transportation in 20 or 30 years' time. And, already I think the majority of new passenger cars in China and elsewhere are going to be EVs. So you want to be in the forefront of that wave. You don't want to be a backwater, which is what's currently the case for the United States, because the politics has become so toxic around climate. But maybe the seeing China becoming such a success story, becoming the first not just industrial but first fully electrified economy, will be transformative. But we'd be better off just buying Chinese EVs and Chinese solar and everything else, because the supply chains are now so dominated and they've got the costs so low. And that's not just because of cheap labor; it's because of a number of factors. But they have very high productivity growth as well. So some of the basic economics have been just so much more positive in China than they are in the formerly industrialized countries.
So we've mostly talked about the good news in terms of carbon emissions, where carbon emissions are falling quite rapidly in the West. They're falling relatively rapidly in other parts of the world as well. The technologies that don't emit carbon can take over. What about the carbon that's already in the atmosphere? So you're obviously saying that you think we're likely to end up somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees of warming. Will we need to deploy technologies to pull carbon out of the air or out of the ocean in order to deal with those changes? And have we made any significant progress on those technologies? Or do you think if we cut emissions sufficiently strongly, we're not going to need to deploy those kind of decarbonization technologies at scale?
Well, it would be much easier actually just to do solar geoengineering and to deploy sulfates in the upper stratosphere, which could deliver theoretically any degree and any temperature target that you want. I mean, we could literally all get together at a COP and say, right, we're going to stop at 2 degrees. We're going to ramp up sulfate production to get to cut the top off that graph where we get the overshoot of temperatures until we can fully decarbonize the global economy. So that would be the easiest way of doing it. It's much harder to sequester atmospheric carbon at the kind of scale that's required to get us back down to like 350 ppm, which is probably the safe level. I mean, there's no mechanism that I can think of which does it at the scale that's required. It needs to go into even the surface biosphere. There isn't enough terrestrial vegetation or land carbon potential to do that. You could get maybe 10 or 20 ppm off, but I don't think the rest of it's, because remember, this is carbon that's come from subsurface reservoirs of fossil fuels, which have been down there for millions of years. Suddenly we've dumped it in the atmosphere. It's going to take a long time for then the surface biosphere to be able to sequester it using natural processes.
So if we don't do that, if we do end up with 2 to 3 degrees of warming, what does that look like for the world? And is that a problem of lasting deterioration of our natural environment, or is it a problem of adaptation? Which is to say, is there some reason why a world that is 2 or 3 degrees warmer is lastingly less hospitable to human life and food production and so on? Or is the problem just that we have built our cities next to coastal lines that may now be flooded, that our agricultural production is concentrated in areas where the land was most productive under a regime that had 2 or 3 degrees less heat. And so there's going to be these massive costs of adjusting but there's nothing inherently worse for humans about a world that is that amount warmer. Is it a question of adaptation, or is it a question of degradation?
Well, it's a bit of both, and I think most of the humans can do most of the adaptation, and most of the degradation will be suffered by natural ecosystems. So, we're all worried about coral reefs, which have already seen 50% losses just through, well, partly through climate and coral bleaching episodes, but partly through other anthropogenic impacts as well, like disease outbreaks and pollution and so on. So a world which is 2 degrees warmer is going to be a world where coral reefs really struggle to survive in the wild at any significant extent. There are other potential collapses, such as rainforests. Maybe the Amazon rainforest can't survive in a world that's 2 degrees warmer. That's not clear, but certainly having the current rates of deforestation make that tipping point more likely. Maybe there's going to be big shifts in ocean currents, like the North Atlantic circulation system and so on. I worry less about sea level rise just because the timescale for that is so long. I mean, you don't tend to see this in the popular media treatments. There was a paper that came out quite recently, basically said that most of the ice sheet mass would disappear even at 1.5 and 2 degrees certainly. But if you look at the graphs lower down, and you see this is a 2500 scenario that it's looking out to. So to deliver multi-meter sea level rise, it's going to take more than 2100. It's going to take several centuries, and that's a very long time to think about. It would be almost like the Tudors worrying about our adaptation prospects today, and 500 years later. So it's absurd. And actually, I think that's the most adaptable prospect. And certainly is reversible as well over that kind of timescale. We can take our foot off the warming accelerator and protect the ice sheets certainly over a century or two. I think the other big one, of course, is food production. Is it going to be possible to produce food at scale in the 2 degrees warmer world? Yes, I think it is, and I think there are adaptation options for crops to keep productivity levels not just at the current levels, but to continue to have them increasing. The other big issue is the thermal tolerance threshold. Like, does it become so hot that humans literally can't survive outside biologically? And yes, that will extend over larger areas of the Gulf, South Asia, and places which are both very hot and very humid. But it's already the case in Dubai that it's intolerably hot. You can't be outside. You can't for any significant time. You certainly can't work in a healthy environment outside. But you're in an artificial environment most of the time in these cities, which uses huge amounts of energy. But if that's decarbonized, that's an adaptation strategy. So I think we've got to kind of think differently. Humans are an incredibly adaptive species. Our technologies change very dramatically under pressure, and I think that humans can adapt and survive in 2 degrees. Well, I mean, I should caveat that by saying there are climate vulnerable countries who I work with who don't have adaptation options, not because of their geographical positions and so much, but because of their socioeconomic factors. They don't have access to capital. Their populations are very poor, and so the impacts of climate change are much more determined by the poverty of your population than by the factors of flood and drought and those kind of geophysical things.
Mark Lynas, thank you for coming on the podcast. Thank you for warning us about the dangers of nuclear war, and thank you for ending on a cautiously optimistic note about the progress we've made in the fight against climate change.